السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. So, welcome to this very first lecture in English here at the Mudiyafa of Sheikh Ismail Sadiq Al-Adawi rahimahullah. And before we begin, let me first express my deep thanks to the administration here at the Mudiyafa. They have been very gracious to facilitate this. I hope to be a wonderful opportunity for you guys, and you find it to be rewarding and of a great benefit, inshallah. And I also want to send special thanks to my fellow friend and Sheikh Amr Yusri, who's not present here today, but I hope this reaches him, inshallah. Okay, so I guess most of you have heard about this course, whether from Facebook or through word of mouth or something of that sort. And you notice that the title for this course is Learning How to Learn, a Modern-Day Study of Az-Zarnuji's the instruction of the student, the method of learning. تعليم المتعلم طريقة تعلم. All right? Before we begin into talking about who's Az-Zarnuji and what this book is all about, let me begin with talking about learning in general, all right, and education, and why did we choose a topic that is related to learning. And of course, you know, learning is a component of education in general. So when we talk about learning, automatically you start thinking about other notions that are related to education and learning as well. So you think of teaching, you think of subjects and disciplines, you think of the content that is being delivered, you think about the medium of delivery as well, whether it's virtual learning or actually attend in a classroom. So you think also of the learning environment. Even if it's a virtual learning opportunity, still you think about the learning environment. Is it an online course where I participate on my own? Or is it something that involves some sort of a discussion forum where I interact with people who are, you know, virtually my classmates, but not in a physical context? So when you talk about learning, you automatically think of the context of education, right? And in order to understand the reasons why did we choose this very part of education, why did we choose learning in specific, why are we not talking about education in general, why are we not talking about teaching, why are we not choosing a subject matter and talking about it? To understand this, let us talk about what is education. You know, there are certain terminologies and concepts. Jazakumullah khairan. There are many terminologies that we kind of, you know, take for granted. We talk about education and we think, oh, this is like schools, universities, you know, books. People read and people study. If you take a look at the etymology of this word, education, or to educate, comes from a Latin root, educare, which means to bring out. To bring out. If you think of a flower that sort of blossoms, all right? There is some sort of an inner part of this flower that comes out through time and by time, right? And this is what education should be all about. It should bring out potentials in learners, and it should bring out also knowledge that is hidden in realities of this universe. You know, I mean, if you take a look at children, for example, and children are really, you know, they experience certain phases of child development. When you take a look at it, it's really a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, when you find a child who's turning 3 or 4 years old and they start developing their own sentences, and note here, they're not using imitation or narration. They start, you know, developing, formulating, or generating their own structure. Yes, grammatically, according to textbooks, they're not accurate, grammar rules, but yet they have this generative, they indulge themselves or they experience this generative activity. They start formulating and composing sentences. And it's really extraordinary because you find a child, you know, for example, 2 weeks ago was just imitating expressions and saying words and just uttering certain, that's interesting. So you find this, children, for example, they develop these sentences even though only just a while ago they've been only imitating words or saying just few expressions or various expressions that they heard their parents or people in their, you know, in their small community are saying. And all of a sudden you find this child saying things on his own. And this kind of childhood development that you see is very similar to what happens to a learner who is beginning in any sort of course of study. It's the same thing. You begin, when you're a beginner in learning, you find yourself just imitating your professor or imitating your teacher or just kind of trying to grapple with things, and you depend a lot on recalling the same things that you have heard before. But unless you do like the child, unless you sort of reflect or ponder or go through the same information processing that children go through, you will then start presenting your own understanding of knowledge. You understand? So this is the core of education. It brings out and it cultivates the potential in human beings that was inherited. It's intrinsic in children since they were very little. This generative activity, and I like to think of learning as a generative activity. Okay, it's an activity that generates knowledge. And on the opposite hand, you find, you know, failing educational systems. You find failing educational systems that really depend on information consumption. You know, spoon feeding, right? The idea, the vision of education as a generative activity or as a facilitation or a cultivation of an intrinsic feature in human beings. They are able to generate ideas and language as well. So you find failing educational systems, they depend on spoon-feeding information.
Yeah.
And instead, can you just write your question down?
Or I just want to know if you have a question, so is it going to be a lecture and then we ask the question that by the end of it, or it's going to be a discussion? If
I'll let you guys have the discussion at the end, but
okay, so the discussion and then I read your questions and you can ask me.
Exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, as I was saying, that education is a generative activity, or at least it should cultivate this generative trait in human beings. And you find this generative feature or trait is very, you know, something that you can distinguish human beings from other species. It's a very distinct feature that we have this ability to generate knowledge. Not only acquire information and accommodate ourselves with different details around us, but we can actually generate and use analogy and reasoning and arguments even to explore things around us. You understand? And this distinct feature between humans and other species is very important to realize. And when you find that the Ummah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and when you find that the very first 5 verses, and people always think of Iqra as, you know, sheer reading. And there's a difference between abecedarian reading, which is just to vocalize words. You know, abecedarian reading is just going through a text, reading the words out loud, having an ability to utter, you know, A, B, C in a sort of a word or a sentence or a paragraph. But the ability to analyze texts, for example, to read between the lines, to note certain differences in terminologies and in words, and why did this writer articulated this concept in this form or fashion or in this order different than that other person, then this kind of engagement in reading is different than reading newspapers, the abecedarian thing. Reading newspaper on one hand is something, and reading a text, even if it's a fictional text, to understand new things, or to expand your knowledge, or to kind of test your mind even, or go through like an excursion in knowledge. This is different than abecedarian reading. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to Prophet Muhammad, Iqra, we're not talking, this verse is not talking about abecedarian reading. Okay? And how do you know this? The verse says what? Read, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, right? Which is, read in the name of your Lord, who created man from a blood clot, right? خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ عَلَقٍ اقرأ وربك الأكرم. And here, this verse, اقرأ وربك الأكرم, read, and your Lord is most generous. And I always think of learning and education as something, as a complex phenomenon. I don't know if any of you have studied biology before. If you're familiar with the idea of complexity theory, it's also related to chaos theory. And chaos is not talking about people running all over the place in the streets and being random. Chaos in science means initial dependence, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. What do they talk about? They examine things like, how fish, they do the schooling. Fish schooling in the sea, they go like this, they make like different patterns, all right? Or the birds, they do certain patterns when they fly in groups. They found that there isn't any sort of a universal command. There is no control room. And I always say it's only in Nemo where you find a fish coaching others. All right? Only in a movie. We're glad that we have the lights back. It's probably because those people came in. I'm not saying anything about the early comers. All right, so we're talking that education or learning is a complex phenomenon. Complex phenomena means what? There is no central command in education. Maybe in an educational system, a design system, a structured system. But when you talk about education in general as a human phenomenon, it's really complex in the sense that you don't have this leading fish in the sea saying, okay, when I move this way, you're going to move with me that way. You don't find fish or birds coaching others how to move in patterns, right? But they generate it. And scientists, when they take a look at this self-organizing systems, this is what they call them, self-organizing systems in biology. And one of them, as I'm talking, is this bird, this fish, for example. So you find that the sum or the result of the interaction between each fish and the one next to it results in a sum greater than its parts. If you take a look at every single individual fish, learner, you would never expect that this kind of expansion in knowledge would ever happen. You understand? So learning is just like how fish interact together and doing patterns. If you, on your own, start studying the world, you would never reach anywhere unless you're engaged in some sort of a self-organizing system. And don't think of it as a learner in a school. I'm talking as human beings trying to understand the world. And for this very reason, because learning, the byproduct of solid learning process is always great, the sum of it is always greater than its parts. And for this reason, he said, subhanahu wa ta'ala, اقرأ وربك الأكرم. You understand? Now you get the connection. That if you read on your own, and others start reading as well, the result would be greater than if you have read on your own and would stop there. So, اقرأ وربك الأكرم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would facilitate this kind of expansion in exploring or revealing the hidden realities of our existence on this planet. اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم, who taught by the pen. And you find there was some kind of a reference to this idea by Avicenna ibn Sina in his book Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat. And when Imam al-Razi was starting to explain this book, he said that anything that is existent has 4 levels of existence, actually. One level is its existence in actuality. So this book, for example, or this binder, or whatever paper is being binded, these papers have a level of existence. They're existing in actuality. I see them and I perceive them, right? So there is another that comes from this, another kind of existence. They exist in my mind, all right? Some kind of understanding, some kind of perception, and then you turn this perception into a conception. That we're not talking about these papers in particular, we're talking about papers in general, for example, right? So this comes another kind of existence. So I grasp this reality by my mind, and it exists in my mind. I discovered something, so it exists in my mind. Then I articulate this, all right, into a verbal expression. And then there comes the 3rd level of existence. And then the 4th level of existence would be when I start jotting down what I have articulated, but by my verbal expression. So writing, books, are actually what? If you take a look at textbooks as a level of existence of actualities in the universe. You understand? So if you have a book about astronomy, for example, and you find names of planets and maps and so forth, these, even though they are written down, but the actual planets have some sort of existence in textbooks and in minds of learners and people who think. All right? So, and it's very sad when you think how these very first 5 verses were revealed to Prophet Muhammad, and then sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then you find many societies, many Muslim societies, they're lagging behind in education. And not only that, you find high rates, the highest rates of illiteracy are in Muslim and Arab countries. And this is actually shameful, to be honest. And I know some people would be disappointed from me or criticize me for saying that this is shameful, but it is. And you would not be able to change a reality, would not be able to change a current situation unless you're honest with yourself. And it is shameful. And by the way, when we talk about literacy, we're not talking about the abecedarian reading, just vocalizing words, but we're talking about having knowledge. And again, I keep repeating, there's a distinction between information and knowledge. You know, information, you can have bullet points or a list of facts, but you don't know what to do with them. Knowledge is engaging yourself in this generative activity, working out, treating those facts or details or questions to come up with something new other than what you already had. Imam al-Juwayni in the book called Al-Irshad, he says that all acquired knowledge, he says customs means habits, all right? Observing the habits of humans. Custom insists or continues to insist that all acquired knowledge is discursive. Again, custom continues to insist meaning observing the human habits, there is a confirmation that any sort of acquired knowledge, any sort of acquired, something that you did not have originally as a human, and you grasped or you gained, is discursive. All acquired knowledge is discursive. Discursive means it is preceded by some sort of reasoning, some sort of working out. And this is, again, we return back to this distinction between humans and other species. We are able to reason things. All right? Why am I saying all of this? Because we said in the very beginning, learning is part of education. And you would not have a correct view of learning unless you understand what education is. If you think of education as a consumer, you're consuming information. All right? You just go to school or go to university to have a certificate or a degree in order to work. You understand? It becomes this economic side, the economics of education, and we'll be talking about this. And actually, Az-Zarnuji makes reference to these issues in his book. The idea of financing your learning experience. And you find in the West, in America, they have this great problem when you have graduates of universities unable to pay back their student loans. You understand? They get loans from banks to, pay for their college tuitions, and then when they return from college to the workforce, they find difficulties having a job or a job that pays, and then you find a big problem where they cannot pay back to the banks, and you might find students going to jail or declaring bankruptcy earlier in their lives just because they cannot finance their learning experience. Or you might find here in Egypt where you would choose what you're learning because you believe or you assume after a few years this would be a paying expertise, for example. So you become an engineer not because you're really into engineering, but rather because engineers get money. They get good salaries. And money, economics, finance becomes the controller, if you might say, the catalyst for why we learn. And it's not because we as humans are lifelong learners. And because of this consumption, we are consuming information. At some point, I don't want to study anymore. I earned my BA. I'm not supposed to study again. And you start, when you find a graduate who cannot find a job, you find them saying, how come? I spent the 4 past years in earning a degree in order to learn something to work, to get some kind of a work, and yet I don't have it. And you're not willing to go back and learn things, because learning was aimed towards just getting the job. You understand? And because of this reason, you don't find in certain societies the notion of continuous learning or continuous education or lifelong learning as something popular. People stop at some point in consuming information. All right? So you don't have this, transgenerational engagement. People, regardless of their generation, engage themselves in learning things. All right? All right, so having said this, now since we understood some kind of a background, some kind of a vision, we laid it out about what education is. If you go back to think about learning, you kind of have a clearer vision why we're talking about learning. Let me give you some more details. I guess it's an established fact now that educational systems, at least in the Arab world, they're failing individuals, right? They're not meeting the expectations. And maybe in the West, it's the same thing as well. But then, but because of different reasons, all right? Not from the same angles, huh? But what you find now, for example, the boom of online learning, and it started to be in the beginning as some sort of offered courses online by certain universities that have the technology to offer these things. And then you start having online universities. And then now you have MOOCs, massive open online courses. One of them is called Learning How to Learn, by the way. All right, it's offered on Coursera, where I participate in that course as a teaching assistant. And what is really remarkable, the last session that ended of Learning How to Learn on Coursera a couple of days ago, we had the number of enrolled students. We had 2,018 students. 200,018 students, huh? Or 218,000 students, I apologize. So about this 250,000 students enrolled in one single course from all around the world. These kind of technologies, they're empowering, they're allowing the learners to have different venues and opportunities, and those who graduated from a certain major that they now hate and they're looking to kind of transform their career or do this career shift sort of thing, now they have new venues. Plus this MOOC idea, you have now new private institutions in the Arab world that are trying to, develop the educational reality in our societies. But the problem is, again, it's very similar to what happens with companies that try to sell something beneficial, but the consumers are very, they became situated in receiving things that are sort of unhealthy. And what I mean by this, you have graduates of institutions coming from educational systems that have, cultivated, they have kind of put into or programmed, I would even put it to that extent, people develop the habit of being spoon-fed. So when they're allowed the opportunity to learn on their own at their own pace and according to their set conditions, you may be learning at a learning space, or take your laptop somewhere, or go to a cafe, or learn at home, or at night, or in the morning. You have different options, and yet you find sometimes individuals having difficulty taking charge of their own learning. And that is because the educational systems that they have went through, instead of cultivating this generative activity, in return, they come back acting as consumers, not as learners. You understand?
Yeah.
And for this reason, why we're talking about learning how to learn. Because if you are empowered with skills, techniques, methods, strategies on how to learn, and actually when you go through the process of unlearning what you have got from schools or universities, when you do that, when you're empowered, when you and I are empowered with learning skills, we become self-regulated learners. And there is a notion in educational psychology, it's called learning autonomy. All right? When you talk about learners being responsible agents, they are responsible, you are responsible for your own learning process. And this is something that 800 years ago, Az-Zarnuji is talking about. This book was not directed to teachers. It's called Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, instruction of the student, the method of learning. He is talking to learners. And here you find 800 years ago a Muslim scholar talking about individuality in learning, rather than Durkheim, a sociologist, talking about classrooms as learning communities. And it's very interesting that you find 800 years ago, Muslim scholars yes, there are present texts in the Muslim tradition that talk about learning communities and teaching and methodologies of teaching. But it's interesting that they actually talked about this kind of individual responsibility. I should be responsible for my own learning experience. I should be able to learn without moderation or supervision, a higher supervision. Because individuals, as we see now, when they're given the time and they're given the space and they're given the opportunity regarding content or subject matter, they still find it difficult to engage in certain courses or in certain learning experiences because they did not keep this generative activity that was intrinsic in them. All right? I guess if you understand what I have laid out now, you understand why we're talking about learning in particular. We're not talking about education in general or education from a philosophical point of view or a sociological point of view. We're talking about learning how to learn. Let's move on to the second point, which is, and I'm sorry I'm giving you all these introductions in the beginning, but I want you to understand, I want to put you in context, all right? Why did this whole program is now available for you guys? When we talk about learning how to learn, and you find about 20 years ago, and I'm afraid I might have these dates kind of not accurate, but a professor from England, Guy Claxton, that's his name, Guy Claxton, professor at University of Bristol, which is considered to be they call it a red brick university, one of the 5 universities that were built in England during the industrialization period. Guy Claxton talks about building the learning power. That's what he calls it. And actually he coined a term for this called learnacy. All right? Learnacy. It's similar to accuracy, for example. The power or the ability to be accurate. So having the ability to learn. He calls it learnacy. And recently, as I have mentioned, this learning how to learn MOOC developed by the University of California, San Diego, and co-instructed by 2 magnificent professors, Professor Barbara Oakley and Professor Terence Sinwosky. Barbara Oakley, she wrote a book called A Mind for Numbers, and don't let the title of the textbook kind of sway you away from it. It's not only for people who are trying to wrestle with mathematical problems only. It's about practical tips and advice on how to learn. And at the same period of time, we're talking about late 2014, another book came out by Benedict Carey. It's called How We Learn. And I had the privilege of receiving an advanced reader's edition of this book for review. And he talks about all these theories and scientific research and findings that tell us more about how we learn and the best techniques for learning. There are various professors that have been engaging into studying the areas of learning and studying techniques. You have, for example, John Dunlosky from Kent University has done extensive research, even to the point they did research on marking, using a marker while studying. Is it something useful or not, for example? So they have done extensive research in that. You have Joseph Novak from Cornell University. He did a research on what is called concept mapping. And we'll be talking about it in details in the coming weeks. Concept mapping is different than mind mapping. Mind mapping in Arabic is al-khala'it al-dhihniyya. Concept mapping is khala'it al-mafahim. And there are 2 different points. Mind mapping, you can use it if you're doing if you're trying to brainstorm for an event or to write a paper, for example. You're just trying to get all your ideas on paper. Concepts or concept mapping, it starts with a concept that has a definition or a meaning, and then all the underlying or the I should say the topics or the notions that branch off from this holistic concept. We'll be talking about these in details, and we're using the board for these things and so on and so forth. But the point is, learning how to learn this really important topic. It's at the intersection of various fields: neuroscience, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, what else? Even behavioral economics. All of these different fields, they come together at a certain intersection to provide learners with techniques. All right? So I guess now you have some kind of an understanding why we're talking about learning in particular. Why did we choose this text to develop a course on learning how to learn? What I usually have done before in certain study groups, and some people I know here where they attended these study groups on learning how to learn, the Coursera course, what we have been doing is covering the research findings of the West, and then giving sometimes certain examples of texts from the Islamic tradition that covers the same questions. They might not have the same answers or the same solutions or the same, they don't not necessarily have the same approach in tackling these questions or these concepts, but at least they go in parallel. There's the same concern about these topics. In this course, we're doing the opposite. So if you're interested in learning only learning techniques, you would get a benefit out of this course. If you're interested in reading a book about Muslim tradition or experience new things or get more information about Islamic learning tradition, for example, or Islamic history, you'll be interested in this course. Or if you're interested in both. So we're going to be going through this book and then providing some comparative illustration of what's going on in the West. And we'll draw some kind of reflection. And I really ask you guys to, when we're going through this text, not to read it, again, not to read it as abecedarian reading or this kind of knowledge information consumption. I want you to engage yourself, indulge yourself in ruminating this text. And what I mean by ruminating, this word is very interesting. It means to think deeply. All right, to ruminate means to think deeply. But rumination also is the process of digestion that happens to cattle, like sheep and cows. And I'm not, this is not an insult. This kind of rumination process, the cattle, when they're trying to digest food, after they swallow it, it is returned again to the mouth for them to chew it again. And they call this thing that they're chewing it again the cud. All right? And this process of swallowing and then trying to digest and then returning the food again for further chewing and then swallowing it again, this process is called rumination. And this is what I'm asking you to do, not to chew the papers, but to kind of indulge yourself into treating whatever you're reading. You understand? To go through the text in this kind of rumination process. All right? Let me give you some details about this text. The author of this text, his name is Burhanuddin or Burhanul Islam al-Zarnuji. And there's kind of a surprise in here. The biography of the author. The biography of the author. He was alive during 593 Hijri years. So we're talking about the 12th, 13th century AD, all right? And he was a student of someone named Burhanuddin al-Marghinani. This is all we know. about the author of this text. We don't know his full name. We don't have an accurate date for his death. Ismail al-Babani in Hadiyat al-Arifin, he said he died approximately 610 after Hijrah. All right, this is all we know about. That an approximation of his death date. That we know the name of his teacher, and that he was called Burhanuddin al-Zarnuji. All right. We know that Zarnuj is an area now which is located in Asia. We're talking about the areas near Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and all these stands. I don't know in particular where is it exactly on Google Maps. I'll be very glad if somebody can point it out. Where is Zarnuj now? Where is the exact location of Zarnuj nowadays? But all we know about him, as I said, is a location, Zarnuj, which is a place in Asia after Iran, and we know an approximation of his death date and the name of his teacher. And I want to mention something about his teacher, and then explain why, or how come we're reading a book that we know nothing about the author. All right, is that kind of a negative thing about the book or not? His teacher, and this is how they called him in the books of, we have some things in the Muslim tradition called Kutub al-Tabaqat, all right, or at-Tarajim. And what they mean is, they get the biographies. We had scholars where they would record biographies of previous scholars. So they're sort of historians, but for the biographies in particular. They're not really concerned about political, economical, or societal things to be as a supreme goal, but rather that their primary aim is to record the biographies of scholars. So he was known in the books of the Hanafi madhab, and we have 4 schools of jurisprudence in Islam. One of them, or the very first school that started by Imam Abu Hanifa, called the Hanafi school. So he was a student of a great Hanafi scholar. This scholar, as I said, his name is Burhanuddin al-Marghinani, and he's known for a book that is published, printed here in Egypt by Dar al-Salam, if you know it, in 4 volumes, called Al-Hidayah, the Guidance. And this Al-Hidayah book explains another small text called Bidayatul Mubtadi. So it's Al-Hidayah fi Sharh Bidayatul Mubtadi, or Al-Hidayah fi Sharh Al-Bidayah, so it would rhyme. Bidayatul Mubtadi means what? Means the beginning of the beginner, or the beginner's beginning. And when you find, only from analyzing the title of the book, when the teacher was very concerned about beginners, you find the student was also very concerned about students, to the point he wrote a book called Instruction of the Student, the Method of Learning. And it's interesting because they call him Tilmidu Sahib al-Bidayah. You understand? The student of the author of Al-Bidayah or Al-Hidayah. So he was known also as the student of Burhanuddin al-Marghinani. So Burhanuddin al-Zarnuji, the author of this text, was also called the student of Burhanuddin al-Marghinani. And this is very interesting. When you find a student, of course he's a different level of student than we are, but when you find a student addressing other students about learning techniques, and I find this is something for you guys to reflect on, that roles of learners and students you can actually engage in the education process. You don't have to be a professor in order to help others. There are different ways to help your fellow classmates or learners without necessarily teaching them and telling them, oh, all right, I'm the doctor and your guys the student. It's not necessarily like that. You can develop the learning process you're in by helping others cogitate, think deeply about their learning process, their learning experience, what they're going through. Okay, so this is the biography of the author. We don't know much about him. Does this kind of hinder what we're going to be doing? I mean, we're reading a book that we don't know anything about the author. All we know is a location, few dates, the name of his teacher, and this is pretty much it. And guess what? This is the only book that we have received from him. And what's really interesting, you find in a book called Education and Learning in the Early Islamic World by Lawrence Conrad. And in page 8, and I want to read out these things, these kind of details for you guys. You find on page 8 in this book, and by the way, there are certain texts that I'll be putting up the links for them in a Facebook group. By the way, I know there's only a Facebook event page, right? You'll find tonight or by tomorrow a link for a Facebook group where I'll ask you guys to join in. It'll be a closed group for those who attend. And all these texts, you'll find them in PDF format for you to download and read if you would like. What is really interesting, that this book was printed in the 16th century, a Latin translation. All right, and I'll give you the details in a bit. One second. This is also a good chance for you guys to have a break from my talk. So here we go. There was in Utrecht this guy named Adrian Relland. Adrian Relland died 1718, and he was they called him a Reformed theologian. This guy, with others, translated the text of Burhanuddin al-Zarnuji into Latin. And we're talking, again, 1718. And then another person who actually worked on translating this book, and he was a Lebanese Maronite Christian named Abraham Echlensis. This guy, he died in Rome, 1664. So this is another earlier print of this book in Latin, translated Burhanuddin al-Zarnuji's The Instruction of the Student, the Method of Learning, into the Latin language. And then there is another famous, later on in late 1900s, and with exactly about 1892, Karl Kaspari, and he printed this in Leipzig in Germany. Another translation of Burhanuddin Zarnuji's text to Latin, I believe. And I have a PDF copy, which will be present in the Facebook group also, of this Orientalist effort to translate this book. And what he actually did, he printed the Arabic with the Latin and the Arabic text. He did he grasped certain annotations. He pulled it out from a commentary by a sheikh named Ibrahim ibn Ismail. And Ibrahim ibn Ismail, he died 1998 Hijri years. So we're talking about 500 years ago, which is very close to the same date of the very early translations of Burhanuddin Zarnuji's text. When you think of 1664, which is about 350 years ago or 400 years ago, and you find that 500 years ago, there was this scholar, this sheikh, his name is Ibrahim ibn Ismail. All we know about him is this, Ibrahim ibn Ismail. And that he wrote Sharh Ta'lim al-Muta'allim. You understand? It has been printed various prints as well. Why am I saying all these things? Huh? One of them, let's touch upon why we don't know anything about the authors. This, huh?
Because it's about the order of knowledge. It's not about the author. It's about what they are spreading and how to show it.
This is one thing. And the other is that the author compiled the text. It's not an absolute authorship where he writes things from his mind that he generated on his own. It was more of a synthesis. He kind of gathered certain texts and narrations and things that he quotes his teachers were doing, and things that other students, and perhaps we might say classmates or learning mates, were doing and learning as well. And he made this he weaved these things together in a text. And he also included some parts of edification where, he would call upon your, sense of contemplation and spirituality as well. So it was not only methods and techniques and advice. You would find certain, poetic verses. You would find certain narrations from the Prophet ﷺ, or verses, or things that are related to spirituality as well. So he gives it a moral dimension. So all in all, this author, what he really did is kind of a person that got ingredients from different places and made this recipe and gave it out to you right off. And actually, I am personally glad that we don't know much about him, because this means the importance of the text, not because the author is famous, but rather the content itself made it famous. You understand? So it's not really because who authored the book. It's because what has been included in the book. One of my shuyukh, Sheikh Abdul Nasir al-Milibari, and he's from India. And when I put the advertisement of this course on Facebook, he told me, until now, until today, this book is the very first book that they give it to learners in India when they start studying Islamic sciences. Before you do anything, go through this book. And I want you to compare local Muslim communities in India giving learning how to learn in the beginning, rather than indulging into, all right, here's the text, you read, and examination, and marking, and grades, and so on. All right? So they're coaching their students to go through this, actually pondering on learning before they engage themselves in learning. All right? So this text, until this very day, is very relevant. As I said, it's used in India. Here in Egypt, certain scholars, they explain it in Arabic. It's okay. Certain scholars, they explain it in Arabic. In Al-Sham, like Syria and Jordan and the Sunni scholars of Lebanon as well, they would explain this book. So all in all, it's a famous text. The current translation that has been distributed to some of you, and the rest, I'll bring them the printed copy next time, inshallah. You'll find that it is translated by von Grunbaum. You'll find his name right here, and Theodora Abel. And this book was translated to English 1946. And it was printed later on with a foreword by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf also. But I think the copy on Amazon, you might find a used copy, but I think the original copies are out of stock or out of date. I have no exact idea about this. Last thing before we talk about some things in the book or we get some questions for people or discussion. As I said, learning how to learn was discussed in the Muslim world 800 years ago, right? That doesn't mean that the topic emerged 800 years ago. Remember, there are 4 levels of existence. Now you probably understand why I explained it in the beginning.
Yeah.
All right? For something to be written, it had to be existent in actuality. So learning techniques were performed. And then some kind of reasoning, some kind of discursive knowledge grasped this actuality, this reality. They perceived that certain students excel because they have this learning, learnability or learnacy, or they build their learning power. And always think of learning power as, you know, like the gym. You know, if you don't practice your muscles, you'll not, you know, build muscles also, right? And the same physical weakness that you might have or you might experience because of not practicing, same thing happens in learning as well. So, as I was saying, this doesn't mean having this text present 800 years ago doesn't mean that the topic emerged 800 years ago. It means that this topic was ruminated over generations until it reached a point where they have to write down a manual for students. Because there has been other books published before him by about 200 years or so. A book by Ibn Abd al-Barr, Al-Jami'u fi Bayani Adab al-Ilm wa Fadlih. All right, the compilation of the etiquettes of knowledge and learning and the merit of learning or knowledge. This book, it's more of narration. He puts narration in almost a numeric order. And it's not a book that has been weaved as a manual to be read. You understand? So for this to be written in 800 years ago, it had to go through this rumination process of thinking about learning how to learn and observing it. And then start expressing things, and perhaps these things, and actually this is what happened, you find the author quotes his teacher, Burhanuddin al-Marghinani, all right? So he quotes his teacher, but not in jurisprudence, but in learning techniques and methods, all right, and advice and so forth. Logistics, and then I'll open to discussion, open the floor for discussion and questions. This course should be 8 weeks, and this is the first lecture. We have 2 spare lectures at the end, so it might extend to 10 weeks according to discussions and so forth. All right? So it's from 8 to 10, and I hope that we stick to 8, all right? So we kind of want to overlook the 2 spare, all right? This is one thing. The other, attendance. Give the ladies from the back and the guys as well. Here you go. All right, just jot your name down, and please in print, not in cursive, so I can read it.
Okay. The name.
Yeah, just your name. Yeah, if you can put down the date in the beginning, just do me that favor. Thank you. What I'm really trying to do in this course is to have it similar to the Islamic traditional circles, but at the same time have it like similar to a course or a workshop. So you're gonna find this kind of fusion because the topic itself is a fusion. You understand? So in certain aspects, we might find ourselves structured like a learning circle in traditional Islamic education, and in another to get at least this kind of accommodation with the text itself. You know, having the feel of how they used to study and to contextualize what they're writing. And this is important. This on one hand. On the other hand, we'll do this kind of Western approach of courses. Having said this, I will not be reading this text word for word. All right? What I'll be actually doing is two things. Having a thematic approach. All right? And I urge you to read the course outlook that has been published on the event page. All right? You'll find that on the following or in the coming week, we'll cover 2 chapters, for example. So what we're doing is we'll be covering chapters in a sort of a thematic approach, but at the same time, to get this feel of learning, Islamic learning circles, I would highlight certain parts of the text, explain certain terminologies or concepts, and or even talk about the positioning of the text itself. Why did he order the chapter in this fashion? Why did he put the verse before the hadith, or the hadith, the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, before the verse? Why did he put this in this place and not that place? All right? To kind of ponder, let you engage yourself in this analytical reading. So on one hand, we will highlight, it's like zooming in and zooming out. All right? We'll be just going through these themes of the chapters, while I'm giving also a comparative illustration of what's going on in the West, and at the same time doing those zooming in on closing at certain parts of the text and explaining terminologies and intricate details or subtle differences that might not be apparent from your initial reading in the text. All right? For the certificate, it's a certificate of attendance. It's something to encourage you guys. It's more, I believe the importance of this course lies in many things. One hand, it's in English, and it's something, I guess, new here in Egypt and here at Al Madiafa. And I forgot to mention in the beginning, this Al Madiafa was originally, it's like a hosting, it's a co-learning space for my friends from Mishkat. Free advertisement here, right? My friend from Mishkat, the co-learning space. I mean, this was a co-learning space. The founder of this place, Sheikh Ismail Sadiq Hassoub Al-Adawi, who used to be the Imam of Al-Azhar Mosque. He was not Sheikh Al-Azhar. He was rather the Imam of the, he would actually conduct the Friday sermons at Al-Azhar Mosque. And he established this Madiafa, this co-learning space, and I'm stealing the word. He established this place to offer parallel circles of study with whatever was being offered at Al-Azhar. And to this very day, this is what's happening. You find students attending at Al-Azhar and then crossing the street to attend here. So I'm trying to get you in the same kind of milieu of this Islamic circles, and at the same time engage yourself in some kind of a course. All right? So the certificate is something, it's like an add-on. All right? Basically, your attendance and participation, and as I said, we'll be giving homeworks. For now, I know most of you don't have the texts. So if you can use the PDF, it's available, and next time you'll have it in front of you. Otherwise, at least, you know, get yourself in the mood. But from next week and further on, I'll be giving some sort of homeworks. Yes, I mean, you'll not get bad marks. I mean, there's no marking system in this. But it's for your own benefit, all right? It's not intended to put any sort of stress or pressure, but rather to let this event a generative activity, as we said earlier. Okay, any questions?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have 9 questions.
9 questions?
Yeah.
Can we take like 2 and then see if others have questions and then return back? 3. That's 1/3 of the 9 questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Firstly, you didn't start about introducing yourself. Like you didn't tell any information about you. Is it on purpose, just to tell us that it's not important, you know, what the author, professor? This is the first one. The second one, will it be helpful to read the book in Arabic because there are Egyptians in here who can read the book in Arabic, so will it help? The third question is, you told us right now that the course is intended to be told in English here because it's a new thing. I want to know more about the reasons for teaching it in English, right? And you've talked about the Abecedarian reading method, and there is another method. I want to know the other method, or I need to check for it.
I guess this is 4, right?
Okay.
I did some Abecedarian listening, and I let you put the 4th question. All right, so don't take advantage of it, but it's okay. I'll turn back to you, I'll remember. Let me start from the bottom up. Abecedarian reading is just vocalizing the words. It's like reading, you know, People's Magazine or something.
ممكن تعيد السؤال بس عشان ما فهمتهوش.
Okay. Abecedarian reading. I mentioned something called Abecedarian reading, which is vocalizing, as I was saying, vocalizing the words and sentences. It's just like reading a newspaper. It doesn't. When you're reading, most of the articles in newspapers does not require you to do reading between the lines. Most of them. I'm not saying all. Yes, some writers you must do that with them. But in most cases they're not putting knowledge between the lines. It's probably political messages or something. All right. So, but putting that aside, reading a newspaper or reading a magazine or something. I don't know any magazines in Arabic. People's Magazine or something. I don't know. Teenagers, they read teens, I guess. You don't need to indulge yourself in analytical thinking or critical thinking or looking up terminologies or having this etymology dictionary next to you looking at roots, Latin roots of this English word. So basically, Abecedarian reading is just vocalizing the sentences, but not indulging your mind into analyzing the words and the texts and so forth. Perhaps at some point we can talk about how to read a book. Yeah. That would come in details later on. Yes?
Okay, this is perfect explanation. I need to know if the other type of reading, does it have a name I can look for it? And
Mortimer Adler has a book called How to Read a Book, and he explains different styles of reading. But this is a general sort of distinction between Abecedarian reading and reading for knowledge, sort of speak.
Okay. So it doesn't have any.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have. I can't recall a terminology for this umbrella of analytical reading, so to speak. Why in English? Why not in Arabic? Because, as I said, the Arabic explanation of this book has been widespread. It has been explained in Arabic various times. And also, this topic has been addressed by other teachers actually here, but using different texts, not this one in particular. And also this text, we have the English translation of it. And perhaps in the future, and if we ever have the opportunity to have further courses in the same topic or regarding education, I think the parts in the introduction of Ibn Khaldun on education, they're translated in English. The part about knowledge in Ihya Ulum al-Din by Imam al-Ghazali, the revival of the Sciences of Religion is also, I believe, is also translated into English. So perhaps in the future we can use them. This, I guess, we're trying to offer something parallel to the Coursera course, you might say. All right, just putting it flat out. All right, using the third question, reading the book in Arabic, would it help for the Arabic readers? Yes, and also the not-so-Arabic readers may benefit from this, even with the help of somebody. In cases of inaccurate words, I will also point that out. This would be one of the reasons I would highlight a certain sentence if I find the sentence to be mistranslated or something of that sort. I can't recall his name now, but a professor from the University of Pennsylvania has wrote a book review of this particular translation. And he described Az-Zarnuji to be someone who has great limitations. And actually this intimidated me, to be quite honest. So I'll bring with me the next time his book review, and I'll show you, I mean, who has the real limitations, so to speak. I mean, who's limited in his vision of this book. All right, the last question, or the very first question about me. Well, there was some kind of short bio, and I don't want to call it bio, in the on the events page. So I guess that was enough, I guess. But my name is Ahmed Al-Azhari. But I mean, if you're coming to this place, you're not coming accidentally, I believe. But the very interesting thing that when she's applying this kind of, analytical thinking to my performance, and this is, she's trying to do the same thing, reading why did I not introduce myself. Well, again, I'm not really into talking about myself in public, but I guess you had some kind of understanding from the bio. My name is Ahmed Al-Azhari. Azhari is my last name. Al-Azhari is my last name in the ID, national ID. And I'm not Al-Azhari because I studied at Al-Azhar, so I gave myself this sort of, or it was given to me, so I became Al-Azhari. All right, so I was born Al-Azhari. That was kind of a generated activity on the part of my family, I worked in the field of education as a high school teacher, originally teaching business and economics and psychology. I studied at Tulane University, which is in Louisiana, New Orleans, leadership, communication, and management. How did I end up in education? Again, because I worked as a teacher. And then from that point, working as a teacher, teaching business, I became interested in learning, education, learning environments, and so on. Why am I interested in Islamic tradition? That would be, I would write that in my autobiography, so to speak. So I would leave that out for now. So these were 4 questions. Anybody else before we return back?
I still have 5.
Huh?
I still have 5 questions.
Yes, I do remember, because you have 9, so if you said 4, you have 5 left. Yes. Right? Okay.
I just like you said before that this only learning is only part of the education as a whole. So we in this course or in this class, will you told about some education in as a whole and education from the worldview of Western and the worldview of East or Islamic.
So, what I understood from your question is you're asking if I'll be talking about education in general. Again, I guess I mentioned that education, part of it is learning, right? And other parts like teaching or the curriculum being taught or the kind of books that are being used in learning, or the learning environments and how they're set up and how they're structured, you will find some sort of references in the text of these things. So we're kind of using learning as a key to understand this general understanding of the context of educational systems. But at the same time, we're really concerned with learning skills in itself. It would be really interesting if you can infer from what we mentioned about learning how to learn in the Muslim tradition and learning how to learn in the Western tradition, if you can infer from these two aspects, these two concepts, the difference between the systems in general, the educational systems, that will be interesting then. And perhaps you can present it at the end of this course. All right? What's your name?
Anas.
Anas. All right, so Anas is an example of I can use your question to turn it on you. You're asking me a question, I ask you another one. All right. Who else? We'll take one from the ladies and then Mustafa and then we have Musab. Yes.
I have actually 4 questions.
Okay.
First one, is there any steps that we need to follow to get the best benefits of this course?
Again, if there are any what?
Any steps we need
Any
to
steps?
follow
Okay.
to get the best benefits of this course?
Okay.
And the second one, how can we get the Arabic version of this book?
Okay.
The third one, how we can start reading this book? Do we have a hard copy there as chapter by chapter, or how we can start reading it? The last one, can you explain more about the Abecedarian reading?
Okay. You guys really like this Abecedarian thing. All right.
Just reading without giving practical analysis.
All right. If there are any steps for you to be doing in this course, I guess if I explain all the steps to learn this this course, then we'll be laying out the whole course, so to speak. But if you're asking about a certain advice for this course in particular, as I mentioned earlier, just pre-reading, not coming to the lecture or to the workshop, whatever you want to call it, unprepared. So I would have some kind of exposure before coming to the lecture, to the text itself, all right? To the amount that is prescribed for the certain week, all right? So this is one issue. Another is engage yourself into asking questions about the text. Why did he say this, or why did he not say this? For example, you can have certain expectations from the chapter title. Okay, so if he talks about intention or niyyah or motivation, I expect him to talk about so and so, and then look for yourself. Did he cover what you were expecting? And if yes, how did he cover it? If not, why not? Perhaps put yourself in his shoes. Why did he not cover that? Is it something that has been introduced recently, or is it something that should have been introduced back then, but he kind of overlooked it? And this is something interesting. Remember when I talked earlier about child development and how children develop languages and so on? There is a professor, Gareth Matthews, has this one of his books, The Philosophy of Childhood. He talks about how children are, they're philosophers by nature. Children are philosophers by nature, and what we mean by philosophers, they philosophize, so to speak, this kind of word, or philosophize this word. Kind of, you feel the real philosophy in it. To philosophize, what's going on? All right, there's deep wisdom in it. To philosophize something is to engage yourself in seeking the wisdom of the area that you're indulging into. So there's kind of desperate need or deep curiosity to understand the gist or the depth of something. And you find this intrinsic in children. And we're not talking about academic philosophy. I mean, they apply philosophy, they ask questions, they ask why is this, why is that? And you always get these, out of the blue questions. Where did this come from? And actually, our surprise from how they act is surprising in itself. It's like, you're not supposed to ask. Why you're asking? Huh? Because we got acquainted to this spoon feeding. So I'm telling you this. I'm not asking you guys to be children, but being a child in knowledge is being a beginner. So I want you to indulge yourself in this philosophizing. See, I can say it now. The text, asking deep questions about what he is saying. The Arabic version, you can get it from Dar es Salaam. It's in Al-Azhar Street, and it's Nas City. You can get it from the Cairo Book Festival at a publisher called Dar ibn Kathir. Dar ibn Kathir. You can get this Arabic version of it. There are different prints, but I would recommend this one. What else? About book reading, I guess I covered that, or the third question?
That was it. So you're in reading again.
Yeah, the abecedarian reading, again, like reading newspapers. When you are reading an article in a newspaper or reading a magazine article, do you consider yourself learning something? I mean, do you analyze why did the author say Abu Trika scored a goal, not there was a goal scored by Abu Trika? I mean, I don't know. You get my point. I mean, you don't even put in mind, that was just a quick one. All right, you don't put in mind this kind of context or philosophy or kind of a knowledge background of this newspaper article. It's usually something that is informative, details, facts, things that happened. Unless you're reading an op-ed, then you might engage yourself into analyzing the topic, but not necessarily the text. And there's this question, I understand now why you're asking it. See, there's a difference between thinking deeply about a topic. You can read an article in the Newsweek, and it gets you asking questions regarding the topic that they're talking about. But that doesn't mean you will read the article itself in this sort of analytical reading. You get my point. Most of the newspaper magazine articles in the West, they're printed in the level of a middle school student. All right. Even presidential debates. I mean, they talk about they use like 5th to 6th grade level of English for people. And in the past, it used to be like graduate level. So, but again, what I'm saying is, reading a newspaper or a magazine article doesn't require from you. It's not a prerequisite to have this solid foundation in analytical reading. All you're supposed to do is just read the text, and information are straightforward, so to speak. Okay, who else? Mustafa, I said, yeah.
I had a look in the book and I did some abecedarian sort of.
Okay. Abecedarian is all over the place.
And I guess I'm asking if you could give us some sort of a flavor of what are we going to do in this course. Like, if you could give us like an example of how you are going to make a connection between what the publisher or what the author said like 800 years ago and what is happening now and what is saying in the Twister.
Yeah, I think you're investing in our conversations on Facebook, right? Okay. Who else? And I'll answer your question in a bit. Musad, you had a question, I think, yes?
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one, I didn't get your point about making the course in English.
Okay.
Many done it, but maybe you are different. Maybe you will have different kind of people than who come here.
Okay.
Maybe making a book is a nice idea about translating, making it in Arabic.
Okay.
That's my first one. The second one is, as you are one who read and learning, I would like to know what other books you read, why you choose this one over the others, and I want to emphasize the point of making connections between ايه التجارب الجديدة
English.
اللي حصلت دلوقتي
English though. The scientific research findings, right?
And connecting it to a book written from Halong.
Okay. Very well. Let me start with Mus'ab and then come to the Mustafa's question. You want me to emphasize why we chose this English? I guess part of it has to do with me in particular, and also with whatever is needed. See, I mean, if I do it in Arabic, I'll be replicating whatever is available already, and if I only do learning how to learn in the Coursera sort of MOOC that is straightforward without having this cultural or Islamic tradition flavor in it, it would be just, again, another replication. So the point is, I thought of having this fusion, doing it in English, but at the same time, because this topic is not covered with an Islamic flavor in English, and at the same time, an Islamic text has not been introduced in al-Madyafa, as far as I know, in English as well. So, I mean, it's finding a gap and finding yourself fit to cover this gap, so to speak, you know, to tackle or address the need in this area. I guess that gives you more.
I can help in this. And using a different language is helping also because it attracts our attention. We're focused. We're trying to absorb each word you're saying, and we're trying to write terms that we're going to check later. So you're enriching our language, and you're trying to attract our attention about the topic that we've read about it hundreds of times, and we still cannot apply the right way to learn effectively.
She's enlisted as a teaching assistant, you know, a possible teaching assistant for this course. So I guess, what's your name?
Hanan.
Okay. So Hanan talks about this, that language gives a different perspective in how you indulge into something. I mean, if we talk in Arabic, you might kind of overlook certain concepts, but English, to non-native English speakers, most of you, English is your second language, so it gets you always, I guess, hyped up to understand or grasp what is being said. So there's also a language dimension, you can say, to this.
I can answer using a language. It depends on the purpose of the lecture. It's not a purpose.
Sure.
If your purpose is to develop your English, it's okay. But if your purpose to know and absorb the context of the book, it's about giving it your language. It will be better. It will make you concentrate more. It will make who is embarrassed to ask a question in English